It's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Rosamond Naylor. Roz is a William Wrigley Professor of Earth System Science, Professor by Courtesy in Economics, and founding director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University. Her research focuses on policies and practice to improve global food security and to protect the environment on land and at the sea. Roz, it's great to see you online.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I want to make sure everyone can see the slides here. I've been asked to take a look at resiliency in the future. So I'll take the two excellent talks that have been given so far in addition to the morning talks and look forward. And most people that focus on the global food system focus on terrestrial systems, both agriculture and livestock. And I'd like to look at resilience by bringing in the entire food system, particularly blue foods, and that would be foods produced in aquatic systems, both in freshwater and in the oceans. So as disclaimer, I have no conflicts of interest related to this talk or to the research that I'm doing, no particular funding sources, so I'll just move on with that. But I also want to just give a little warning that unfortunately my power has been going on and off all day. So if I lose power, we will make a quick adjustment with the help from this great organizing committee. So moving forward, as we look at resilience, and as I think about it, I think about food production or income shown on the vertical graph here on a trajectory over time. And when met by some stress or shock, those with high resiliency will just bounce back to the earlier trajectory, and those with low will remain at that low level equilibrium or even go down. And so I'll be looking at that system, but what I really want to ask is resilience to what? What are the shocks we're looking at? And resilience in what type of food system do we want? And again, resilience to whom, for whom? So we've talked earlier today about some of the shocks that we might see in the system, particularly climate change and climate variation. Cynthia Rosenzweig gave a great talk. A lot of people think about climate in terms of precipitation, droughts and floods and so forth. And I love this picture of the Indiana corn farmer who at the same time during the growing season saw on the 2018 on the left and 2019 on the right, that was just the state of the crops. But goes obviously into temperature as well. And what we're seeing in terms of temperature is moving the growing season temperature distribution from that middle distribution that you see further towards a warmer climate as it shifts to the right. And with this, we see greater variation. And so we see a much longer tail in terms of climate, much more hot weather and more record hot weather. And so when we look at this section, this long tail here in the orange or red, I did some modeling with my colleague David Battisti to say, where are we going to see this extreme events play out in the world over the course of this century? So think orange and red here. And this is what we're going to see, mainly in the tropics, and the subtropics are going to go completely out of bounds of any growing season temperature that they've seen in the past. And so we really do want to ask, resilience for whom? We're also wanting to look at resilience to soil erosion, and we just heard a great talk on regenerative agriculture and groundwater depletion. Of course, both of these are also connected to climate. And market shocks. I think many of us in this field didn't think the market shocks could get much worse than we saw in the 2007, 2008 food crisis. But of course, we are seeing with COVID that hunger is going to kill us more than COVID in terms of the global population, not just in poor countries and low income countries, but even in the United States, where many children are affected, and over 1 million people going to food banks for the first time here. And so as we look at this system and the resilience, Michael Pollan wrote a great piece that I think emphasizes some of the points that you've heard in this session. When we look at the biggest shocks we've seen in COVID, meat packing plants, for example, which are heavily impacting people of color who are working in these meat packing plants, who are told that they have to go back to work for essential services. And over half of these people have been infected by COVID. But you're also seeing of the people that are dying from COVID infections, they're the unhealthy people with heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and so forth, also related to this food system that we have. So when we ask resilience in what food system, I think we are looking at a different type of food system. We've talked a lot today about the shift in focus from just producing more calories to wanting a more balanced diet. And I think it's really instructive just to look at the history of China, because if we look at the history of global hunger and how much improvement we've made globally, actually, China was responsible for reducing global hunger to a huge extent through its own green revolution and production of staple crops. But today, when you go out to the rice bowl, and I took this picture on the upper left of these kids in Jiangxi in the rice bowl who are left with their grandparents who have always just eaten rice, and they're eating mainly just starches, and they're not getting the nutrition they need for cognitive development and physical development. In fact, during recess, they often just lie down and take a nap, which is pretty unusual for kids. And so when you think about what sources of protein and micronutrients will populations like this and in many other parts of the world need, will it come from industrial livestock, eggs, legumes? Where are we going to get those nutrients? And the point of my talk is, are we forgetting about aquatic foods, both out of the oceans and out of freshwater? This picture on the bottom right is one I took in Kenya, both pond systems with fish and aquatic plants. 1 in 5 people actually depend on aquatic foods and seafood as their main source of protein. And often, at least for me, since I work in both areas, I either go to meetings where we're looking at global food security and it's all terrestrial agriculture and livestock, or I'm in these ocean conservation meetings, and these two groups are rarely actually coming together. You know, it's often called that fish are rich food for poor people, and rich in the sense of micronutrients, as well as very affordable. And so some of the earlier talks focused on regional food systems, and even within COVID, some of these regional capture fisheries and aquaculture systems have been able to thrive, while some of the globally traded systems have not. And they're highly nutritious in terms of protein, as well as micronutrients like iron, iodine, calcium, zinc, vitamin D, and the long chain omega-3 fatty acids. And so it's not just rich food for poor people, it's really rich food for all people, especially when we look at the obesity and coronary problems that we see in many affluent countries. So I like to think of resilience in terms of this interconnected global food system. On the demand side, we see population driving food demand. We see growth in income driving the demand for animal protein and for feeds. And then we also see incomes leading to transportation demand, biofuels, and fuels. But all of those demands are met by terrestrial crops, by terrestrial livestock and freshwater aquaculture, and by marine fisheries and aquaculture. And all of these play together to create our global food system. So even though the silos I talked about earlier are present in how we do our research, when we go to the grocery store, we see all these things together. I mean, I decide between, am I going to buy fish, or am I going to buy chicken, or am I going to buy legumes? And I think that's true for everyone who has this sort of choice. And these different systems are also connected through developments in shared technology, natural resources, policy, and climate change. So as I think about resilience going forward, I sometimes like to create the analogy to a portfolio theory in your financial systems, where if you have more outputs and inputs interconnecting, that it adds some stability to the system, more substitution possibilities in production, and more substitution possibilities in consumption. And these substitution possibilities, for example, can smooth over some major price variations. So I did some research with a group. This is a paper published in 2014 where we just looked at trends in food prices by sector going into the global food crisis of 2007 and going up to 2013. And in the heavy red line here is the food price index as a whole. And you can see really high variability during that food crisis. At the lower part, the blue line is capture fisheries and the orange line is aquaculture. And we see the coefficient and variation of these prices being as high as 0.4 for cereals and for oil and oil crops, but being only 0.16 for aquaculture and 0.2 for fisheries. And so there's something behind here that is really adding some resilience in terms of the vast diversity that we see in these aquatic foods. But what do we need to know to make blue foods? What do we need to know about blue foods to make better decisions about resilience and about sustainability, really? I'm engaged in a blue food assessment now. I'm one of the co-chairs, and this is an effort with Stanford University as well as the Stockholm Resilience Center. And it engages dozens of international researchers really from all over the world to assess different aspects of this blue food world that I'm talking about. So we think and make the assumptions, as I've done, that these blue foods are more nutritious, they might be more environmentally sustainable, particularly than beef. But what do we really know? There's thousands of species of fish and plants and so forth that are produced around the world. And within this vast diversity, they have different environmental outcomes and different nutritional outcomes. So this blue food assessment is doing a scientific assessment, much like the IPCC did for climate, with really a special focus on what are the nutrition outcomes, environment, climate vulnerability. How do we assess the demand for blue foods and small scale producers in the system? How do we think about the social aspects of this, the justice of blue foods, and the transformation that might see in the system? So the Blue Food Assessment is really aimed at the United Nations Global Food System Summit that will occur next year in bringing in blue foods to the overall dialogue on how do we improve our system. There are certain things that we do know. For example, there's been overfishing in many areas. This red bar shows, the red area here shows more unsustainable fisheries, but there are a lot of sustainable fisheries still. And when we look at the resilience of fisheries with respect to climate change, fish don't stay in one place, they move around. And what are the chances they'll move from a well-managed area to a poorly managed area? Over a third of the fish are likely to move around, and a large percentage here, as you see at the bottom, are likely to move out of their maximal sustainable yield areas. This is Steve Gaines' work at UC Santa Barbara. But aquaculture is becoming much more important. You see that in the orange bars here relative to capture fisheries in the blue at the top and capture fisheries used for food in the dotted line. So as we look at aquaculture um, and capture fisheries, we really need to think about the social aspects, the small scale producers in particular who produce well over 50% of what we see in this area, and over 2/3 up to 3/4 of the aquatic foods that are actually directly consumed. Many women in this group, and a huge majority of the employment in the fisheries and aquaculture area. I think this graph speaks for itself when you just look at aquaculture's growth relative to all other crops terrestrially. It's much higher. This is in live weight. But within that aquaculture realm, you see here the top is freshwater aquaculture. You also see seaweeds, mollusks, and then some of the marine aquaculture down below. Threefold growth in production here over a 20-year period. And so as we think about moving fish into farming systems, um, we can think about the resiliency now of putting ponds into these areas that provides water and nutrition for local producers. This is a picture I took in Orissa in India, one of the poorest states. And if you fly over Bangladesh, this was a great shot taken by Jan Artem um, Bertrand over Bangladesh, where you just see fish ponds really dominating the whole area now. But there are sustainability issues, and I'll wrap up on the sustainability points, particularly related to feeds that go into aquaculture. And the feed is the vast majority of the sustainability issues we worry about. But over the past 2 decades, we've seen huge improvements in feed conversion, how much feeds go into producing the biomass. Fish meal and fish oil levels have dropped in all of these systems, and they've been replaced by plant and animal proteins and trimmings from fish processing. So we tend to use as a metric the the volume of fish that goes into a system versus the volume of fish that goes out. 20 years ago, it was almost 2 to 1, twice as many fish were used as feeds as was being produced in aquaculture. And now that ratio has fallen to 0.28. Amazing progress. And this is a busy slide, but I'll just point out that when we look at some of this system, shrimp, salmon, marine fish that consume a lot of feeds, you can see the percentage of fish meal and fish oil used in those feeds has dropped dramatically over a 20-year period due to just great science. And 3/4 of the fish meal used in tilapia is coming from processing wastes in trimmings, and salmon about half that. So if you go back to the earlier talk on the circular economy, we're really using the circular economy. The waste is going in as feeds now. There's a lot of other waste also going into feeds, everything from livestock waste, feather meal, protein meal, dry distiller grains, and so forth. You can see the cost for protein here on the right, and those costs are vastly less than the cost of anchovies. And so this economics is really driving this transition. I know I'm almost out of time, so I'll just say a few other promising inputs for aquafeeds, not just processing waste. There's insect feeds, algae-based feeds, microalgae biomass that are used in feeds. And going through China, it was a big fish processing area. They use a lot of the processing in feeds now in a circular way. And then even using the flare-offs from natural gas pipelines and in the process of methanogenesis, creating a protein for fish meal and fish oil that has just as much of the quality, nutritional quality for fish, but also has a longer shelf life. And it can come from other forms of waste too. So the circular economy has really come in very importantly here. So let me wrap up with 3 quick points in summarizing. First of all, as we go and see the need for a transition from calories to protein and micronutrients, Blue Foods has the potential to provide this for all people throughout the world. And so we really need to study and understand this better. But there is growing attention towards sustainability, both the social aspects as well as the environmental aspects. I just talked about some of the circular economy improvements that we've seen. There's been enormous progress both in regulating fisheries through quota systems. These are Peruvian fish fleets on the dock because they can't go out right now. But we still see a lot of challenges. I'm happy to talk about those during the discussion. And we see much more connection between land and sea now. We're replacing livestock now with fish on the plate. We're not eating as much beef, we're eating more fish. We see many more of those fish produced in aquaculture system and freshwater systems on land. All of these fish are using more feeds, and those are coming from plant-based materials as well as fish-based materials. And those that don't require feeds, like mollusks or seaweeds, are taking up nutrients from agriculture and food systems on land. They're also sequestering carbon to a certain extent. And of course, the biggest innovations, offshore aquaculture that are taking farming way out to sea, or recirculating, fully recirculating systems on land that are, not interacting with the nutrient cycle at all on land, are some of the directions we're heading. And so with that, I will thank you and look forward to questions later on.
Thank you, Roz. That was absolutely fascinating. I have an absolute ton of questions. I'll start with two, and then we'll transition into the larger panel discussion. The questions are from two different dimensions. The first is the assessment that you're undertaking. You didn't touch on how you're going to bring climate change into that. And we know from all of the work that your group has been doing, the significant consequences of rising ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, and how will you be able to incorporate that in your thinking around blue food?
That's a great question. I might have missed that particular paper that's on climate vulnerability in the blue food system, which is incredibly challenging because most people tend to just assume that these blue foods could be more resilient in the sense that they're buffered in a water body and less maybe impacted by direct heat, but that's really not true. As I said, fish are moving around, and the capture fishery aspect is going to be quite dynamic here. And in the aquaculture area, what we see is real changes in the physiology of the fish, as well as in the pest and pathogen dimensions. And the disease aspects can be actually very, very risky for producers. And the final point I'll make in these extreme events is just in storms and floods and everything can be highly disruptive to these systems. And so we are actually have a specific focus on the climate variability, but we don't have the answers yet. These papers will come out within the next year. By next summer, hopefully be published in time for the Food System Summit.
That's really helpful. And I'll add to that the IPCC special report on warming of 1.5 concluded that at 1.5, we could lose 60 to 90% of all freshwater corals, which obviously has
Yeah.
profound implications. And that is within a decade or two that we could be at 1.5. And so
This
look, that is really important.
very, very important. And fish in warmer temperatures get a higher appetite, so they can grow faster, actually. But the whole system which they're in is very much immersed in the in the water's temperature and acidity of the water and so forth. So it's impacted in numerous ways.
The second question I have goes back to something that Cynthia Rosenzweig brought up early in the day. And I know also that your group does a lot of work on this, Chris Wyant and David Lobel, of looking at the consequences of higher carbon dioxide, not just climate change, but carbon dioxide itself on micronutrients.
Yeah, and I know David and I are very close colleagues and have worked closely together. Most of his work has been in terrestrial crop systems, uh, and um, and so in terms of aquatic foods, how that gets fleshed out is going to be through the feeds. I would say the biggest innovation and the most exciting part of my research on aquaculture in particular, which is just booming, has been on the feed side and trying to actually um, work with the feed side, both the plant-based feeds as well as the animal-based feeds from livestock and fisheries, to address a lot of those micronutrient issues, the anti-nutrient issues that would affect fish production, the toxicity issues that are going to affect us as consumers. All of those are part of the equation and are being studied. Again, there's just gigantic variation in the system.